Somewhere in a quiet side yard in the Midwest, there is a plant that has bloomed every single May for 98 years straight. It was planted before World War II, before the Great Depression had even ended, before the woman who put it in the ground had grandchildren, great-grandchildren, or any idea that someone in her family would still be walking outside decades later, cutting armfuls of flowers from that exact same spot. The house changed hands twice. The lawn was redesigned, the fence was replaced, a pool was built and eventually removed. Almost every corner of that yard was changed, improved, or completely rebuilt. But one thing never changed. That plant stayed exactly where it was. Nobody replaced it. Nobody chased a new trend. Nobody spent every spring wondering what went wrong.
It simply came back. And that is the part most gardeners never think about. Because while some plants quietly become part of a family's history, thousands of others are bought, planted, admired for a few weeks, and replaced before the next season even begins. I'm going to reveal exactly what that plant is later in this video, because the truth is, it's not even the most impressive one on this list. The surprising part is the pattern behind it. Why some gardens seem to almost take care of themselves, while others become an endless cycle of buying, replacing, and starting over every single year. And if you've ever looked at your garden in July and thought, why am I doing all this work just to lose half these plants? This video might completely change the way you choose what goes into the ground.
Because by the end, you'll know which perennials are actually worth giving a permanent place in your yard, and which popular plants may be quietly wasting your time and money. It's not a gardening problem, it's a shopping problem. Here's the mistake almost nobody talks about. Most people don't actually have a gardening problem. They have a shopping problem. And once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere. Walk into almost any garden center in July and you'll find the same scene. A clearance table full of perennials that looked absolutely perfect just a few months earlier. Healthy leaves, beautiful flowers, perfect little pictures on the tags. They looked like the beginning of a dream garden. Then summer arrived. Some are crispy, some are struggling, some are already being replaced by new plants that will follow the exact same cycle next year. And the frustrating part is this. Most gardeners didn't choose badly. They weren't careless. They simply bought what was available, what was heavily promoted, or what looked best on a greenhouse shelf. But a plant that looks amazing in a pot is not always a plant that was built to survive for years in your yard. That's the difference that changes everything. Instead of asking, how do I keep this plant alive? Experienced gardeners eventually start asking, was this even the right plant to begin with? Because the best garden isn't created by working harder, it's created by choosing plants that were already designed to succeed. So let's start with the plants that prove this idea better than almost any others, the ones everyone assumes are the standard choice, but quietly aren't. The imposter effect. Why the standard plant rarely wins. Here's where this gets interesting. Some of the plants we see everywhere aren't everywhere because they're the best. They're everywhere because they were easy to produce, easy to ship, and easy for stores to sell. And once a plant becomes the normal choice, most people stop questioning whether there's actually something better sitting right beside it. Take daylilies, for example. You've probably seen this one thousands of times. It's the bright yellow daylily planted outside banks, gas stations, office buildings, and commercial landscapes all across the country. It blooms beautifully in early summer, puts on a great show, and then almost disappears from the conversation once July arrives. But here's the part most gardeners never realize. That plant became the default choice not because it was the ultimate performer. It became the default because it was easy to produce in huge numbers and easy for garden centers to keep in stock. Meanwhile, there are other daylilies with the same cheerful color, the same height, and the same easy care personality that keep producing flowers from early summer all the way toward the first frost. The difference? One became famous. The other simply kept performing. And that difference shows up again and again. The plant problem that was never your fault. Sedum is another perfect example. For years, one particular orange-blooming variety became the automatic recommendation for late summer gardens. And when it was young, it looked incredible. A perfect rounded mound of dusty rose flowers. The kind of plant you walk past and think, finally, something that actually looks good. Then a few years pass. something strange happens. The center begins opening up. The plant that once looked like a solid dome starts splitting apart, leaving a weak, empty space right through the middle. Many gardeners assume they did something wrong. They cut it back harder. They fertilize. They give it more attention. But sometimes the problem isn't the gardener. Sometimes the plant simply wasn't built for the long term. Newer varieties solve that exact weakness. They keep the same beautiful flowers and shape, but they continue looking full years later instead of becoming a yearly repair project. And that's the lesson. Sometimes the best gardening advice isn't work harder. Sometimes it's choose better. The beautiful plant that starts looking tired. You'll notice the same pattern with Black-Eyed Susan. Almost everyone recognizes the classic golden variety, and for good reason. When it's blooming in June, it looks incredible. But by late summer, many gardeners notice something frustrating. The lower leaves begin developing dark spots. The plant still has flowers, but the foliage underneath starts looking worn out, almost like the plant is already preparing to quit for the season. Again, most people blame themselves. Maybe they watered wrong, maybe the soil isn't perfect, maybe they should have sprayed something. But breeders have already been working on this problem. Newer varieties were selected specifically for cleaner foliage and better disease resistance, giving you that same golden summer display without the tired-looking leaves later in the season. Sometimes the difference between a garden that looks good all summer and one that looks exhausted is simply choosing the right version of the same plant. The plant that looks better on the tag than in the ground. And then we get to coneflowers. This is where things get surprising. Walk through a garden center in June, and the most colorful coneflowers are usually the ones demanding your attention. Bright orange, deep red, almost unbelievable colors. They look amazing in containers under greenhouse lights. But a garden is not a greenhouse. Some of these heavily selected varieties were created to make a dramatic first impression, not necessarily to become a permanent part of your landscape. Meanwhile, the simple purple-pink coneflower sitting quietly nearby is often the one still standing years later. It keeps blooming. It slowly spreads. Its dried seed heads feed birds through winter. And while the flashy varieties may have already been replaced, this humble plant is still doing exactly what it was planted to do. That might be the biggest gardening lesson hidden in this entire video. The plant that gets your attention at the garden center is not always the plant that earns its place in your yard. Sometimes the quiet choice is the one you'll still be grateful for 20 years later. The plants that simply refuse to stop. Now let's talk about the plants that almost seem unfair. The ones that don't need constant attention. They don't collapse after one bad week of weather. They don't need to be replaced every few years. They simply keep showing up, season after season, quietly proving that the best plants are often the ones asking for the least from you. And the first one is a perfect example. There was a lavender blue flowering perennial that many experienced gardeners use almost like a living solution to a problem. Not because it's rare, not because it's flashy, because they are tired of fighting the same empty spaces in their garden year after year.
This plant slowly expands outward, filling gaps without taking over the way aggressive spreaders do. From late spring into early fall, it creates a soft wave of blue flowers that pollinators treat like a permanent restaurant. The funny thing is, many people walk right past it at the garden center. It's not the plant screaming for attention, it's the plant quietly earning a permanent place. Then there's a salvia that reveals another secret about long-lasting gardens. Most gardeners have seen salvias that look incredible for a few weeks until a heavy summer storm bends every stem to the ground. Beautiful one day, messy the next.
But this particular variety was selected for something less obvious: strength. Its dark stems stay upright through summer weather, holding deep violet flowers that look almost designed into the landscape. And after the first wave of blooms fades, a simple cutback can bring another round later in the season. No complicated routine, no constant rescue, just a plant that understands the assignment. The next one surprises people because of its name: hardy geranium. And no, this is not the colorful annual geranium sitting in a summer pot.
This is a completely different kind of plant, a low-growing perennial that quietly fills spaces between taller plants, blooms for months, and keeps returning without needing to be treated like a seasonal decoration. It was recognized as one of the best performers in its category, yet many gardeners have never even heard of it. And that brings us to a pattern you should notice by now. The plants with the strongest reputations are not always the ones with the biggest marketing behind them. There is also a native plant that almost feels like a hidden treasure. Soft blue flowers appear in spring. The foliage stays attractive through summer.
Then autumn arrives, and the entire plant transforms into a glowing golden display that looks like a completely different season of beauty. It doesn't need constant watering once established. Deer usually ignore it, and despite all of that, many garden centers barely give it attention. Why? Because sometimes the best plants are the ones nobody is aggressively trying to sell you. The slug-proof giant nobody expects. Now let's talk about the place where many gardeners give up completely. The dark corner. That area under trees.
The north-facing bed. The spot where every plant seems to struggle. Most people assume shade gardening is just harder. But sometimes the real problem is choosing plants that were never built for that environment. Take hostas. Beautiful plants, but many varieties become a buffet for slugs. By midsummer, their leaves can look like someone punched hundreds of tiny holes through them. But there is one giant hosta variety with leaves so thick and heavy that slugs have a much harder time damaging it. Plant it in the right spot, give it time, and then stop interfering.
Years later, it becomes the centerpiece of the entire shade garden. The kind of plant visitors notice immediately. The kind of plant people ask about, and the kind of plant that reminds you why patience matters. The plants that outlive the gardener. This is where the idea behind this entire video becomes clear. Some plants don't just survive seasons. They become part of a place. They become part of a family's story. A newer mildew-resistant garden phlox is a perfect example. Older varieties often struggled with that familiar midsummer problem, powdery mildew covering the leaves and making the plant look exhausted before the season was even over. But improved varieties were selected to stay cleaner, bloom longer, and keep that late summer garden feeling alive. Plant it once, give it a good start, and years later, it's still there. Then there's a tall native prairie plant with roots that reach deep underground, allowing it to handle conditions that would stress many other flowers: heat, dry periods, neglect.
Once established, it becomes almost impossible to move, not because it's invasive, but because it has committed to that location completely. And that is the kind of plant gardeners remember. And finally, we return to the plant from the beginning. The one planted in 1928. The one that has continued blooming for almost a century. If you're expecting something exotic, this is where the story gets even better. It's a peony. A simple, old-fashioned flower that many people overlook because it doesn't look rare. But planted correctly, a peony can become something completely different. A living inheritance.
The flower your grandparents planted. The flower your children still see every spring. The flower that quietly proves the best gardens aren't always built around what's new. Sometimes they're built around what lasts. The garden you only have to trust, not fix. There's something important hidden in all of this. We often treat gardens like projects that need to be completed. We plant everything at once. We rearrange. We replace. We try to control every little detail, almost like building a room in our house that has to look perfect the moment it's finished. But the gardens that truly reward us over time usually come from a different mindset. They come from choosing plants that don't need constant correction, plants you can trust. The ones you give a good start, water through that first uncertain season, and then allow them to become what they were meant to be. Because sometimes the best thing a gardener can do is not another treatment, another fertilizer, or another trip to buy replacements. Sometimes it's simply stepping back and letting the right plant do its job. A garden built around plants like these doesn't need to be reinvented every spring. It doesn't need a yearly rescue mission. It doesn't need another trip to the clearance section every July to replace what disappeared. It just needs thoughtful choices at the beginning and patience afterward.
And maybe that's the biggest lesson these plants teach us. A great garden isn't created by constantly fixing things. It's created by choosing things that were built to last. Your turn. Now I'm curious about your garden. Which plant from this list is already growing somewhere in your yard? Maybe it's a peony that was planted years ago. Maybe it's a plant you inherited from a previous homeowner. Or maybe there's one here you never heard of before but now want to try. Tell me in the comments. I genuinely love reading these stories because every garden has a history, and sometimes the oldest plants are the ones with the best stories behind them. If this video changed the way you think about choosing plants, consider leaving a like so more gardeners can discover that the secret to a better garden isn't always more work. Sometimes it's simply choosing better. And if you enjoy discovering the plants that quietly outperform the popular choices, subscribe for more garden stories, unusual discoveries, and simple ideas that help you create a landscape that gets better with time. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.